How frightened fanatical societies decimated South American economies.
There is nothing here. We're dying of starvation. There are no jobs. We'll see.
The first sign of the impact of frightened fanatical society in international trade was the appearance of the Japanese after World War II. In the 1970s, 80s and 90s, frightened fanatical Japan began to dominate manufacturing of high-tech products, such as cars and electronics.
Not that long ago, if you walked into someone's house, you could find Japanese electronics brands like Sony, Sharp, JVC, Toshiba, Fujitsu, NEC, Panasonic, and Pioneer, among others. They produced almost all consumer gadgets, including microwaves, digital music players, and televisions,
while creating barriers for Western products in their own country.
Keiretsu were basically alliances of the biggest Japanese corporations, owning shares in each other and, while formally independent, working together to back each other up. And the biggest Keiretsu were given unfair support from the government in the form of enormous loans distributed by the state-owned National Bank of Japan. This basically meant that these alliances had access to an infinite stream of cash to finance their aggressive expansion abroad, while at the same time, the government would block foreign companies from expanding into the Japanese market.
This frightened fanatical Japanese behavior in the area of manufacturing and trade had devastating effect on many Western industries and companies.
Like so much in modern Japanese industry, the robot is basically an American design. But the Japanese have adapted and improved it, so that it's several times more productive now than the American model. The Honda showroom in Tokyo, another demonstration of the same trick. Take a Western product, improve it, and sell it back in vast numbers to Western markets. They started with motorcycles, and in less than a decade, firms like Honda destroyed a British industry. From cars to cameras, they've done the same thing, and this so-called laser beam technique is now being used with robots.
Frightened fanatical Japan was a relatively small country, and they could not dominate all the products that South America relied on, such as clothing, household, and hardware goods, which were still made locally. However, by early 2000s, a much larger frightened fanatical country joined the World Trade Organization and began manufacturing cheaply and undermining all local manufacturing all over the world, including in South America. That country was the frightened fanatical Chinese.
Textiles, toys, electronics. For the last 2 decades, the world has become accustomed to these carrying the label, Made in China.
In the beginning, the frightened fanatical Chinese manufactured and exported some basic products such as clothing and toys, as well as home items such as pots and plates. South American companies that were involved in producing those products were initially affected and often closed down. Within the next 2 decades, by the early 2020s, virtually all type of production was affected and decimated in South America.
Chinese steel is almost 40% cheaper than what's made locally.
Abrirle los ojos también al país entero, la problemática que estamos teniendo con China. China está abusando en todo el mundo y está destruyendo un montón de empresas en todo el mundo, y eso es lo que queremos que se den cuenta de una por todas. Ochipato está a punto de morir justamente por eso, y lo que no queremos es que 22.000 personas en la octava región del Biobío queden sin su sustento.
In 2024, Chile's biggest steel company announced it is shutting down.
The same issues: spiraling unemployment, out of control inflation, and unsustainable debt. What makes it shocking is that this is not an isolated case in one backwater country.
This devastation of local production initiated social disintegration of South American societies. When the economies began to fall, it resulted in high unemployment, poverty, and a breakdown of social services, which in turn led to increased crime.
In Rio de Janeiro, where there's been an increase in violence, robberies, and firefights are happening in places that were once considered safe.
Social unrest and loss of trust in institutions. South Americans began to struggle to meet their basic needs, leading to a decline in overall well-being and social cohesion.
This airport in Argentina's capital is filled with homeless people. It's a snapshot of an economic crisis that's getting worse.
A nation in default, an economy in ruins, a desperate struggle for millions.
Here, there are so many people hungry, miserable, without jobs.
In nature, animals are usually involved in activities such as socializing, searching for food, and exploring their environment. There are situations where animals become highly focused and they have a high sense of urgency in order to increase their performance. These situations are important to the survival. The most common situation is when there is physical danger, such as an approaching predator. In such situations, animals usually produce alarm calls or distress calls to alert others of the danger and to also trigger this increased performance of higher focus and higher sense of urgency to act. These alarm sounds have a similar structure across species. Their structure appears like a cry or a scream. They have acoustically valve-like structure and they are either long or intense or both. Frightened fanatical societies have such sounds in almost every syllable of their languages. It is these sounds in their languages that cause these societies to be under constant high focus and an elevated sense of urgency.
北京 A
That is why they are fanatical workers.
A fanatical work ethic created the thriving car and consumer electronics industries, which helped turn post-war Japan into the second biggest economy in the world.
Fanatical students.
Asian Americans study twice as many hours as the average American.
Now it's around 6:30. We're heading back to class for one more night class and 2 more self-study sessions. And then we'll end around 10:20. That's when we can go back to our dorms and sleep.
If you would like to investigate this idea a little bit more closely, please check one of my book versions on the topic. Evolutionary Alarm Sounds Within Languages is the first version, Frighten the World into Prosperity is the second version, Motivate Poor Countries to Develop is the third version.
In the 20th century, South American countries were doing relatively well in comparison to other developing countries. In fact, some countries such as Argentina were some of the richest countries in the world in the early 1900s.
This is Argentina. 100 years ago, it was one of the wealthiest places on the planet, and a country so economically powerful and advanced that it was widely expected to become an economic rival of the United States.
Venezuela was the 4th richest country on earth, richer than the United Kingdom, yet is now the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere.
Many countries in South America had developed agriculture and had local manufacturing that produced basic products such as household goods, hardware products, clothing, toys, etc.
Why did Chinese come to this tiny Spanish-speaking country?
American policymakers must now grapple with the consequences of China's rise in every corner of the world, including in their own backyard.